When we look at the narrative in the gospel of Jesus' life, we see that it moves from his birth through growing up to the public ministry that begins at the time of his baptism, the public ministry that takes place in Galilee, then the movement from Galilee to Jerusalem, and the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem, where his life concludes with his crucifixion, death, and resurrection. That's the narrative of the gospel. Somewhere around the end of 1960s, early 1970s, as the Roman Catholic Church was going through its change and renewal following the Second Vatican Council, that the church leaders got together and said, we need a better way, particularly because the Catholic Church was not known to be too into the Bible, so to speak. Since the time of the Reformation, Protestant Christianity spent lots of time focused on the Bible and understanding the Scripture. Well, in the Catholic Church, to look at the Scripture was mostly to support the dogmas and doctrines of the Church, rather than simply to look at the text itself and to have an understanding of what the Hebrew Scripture and Christian Scriptures were about. And so the church leaders got together and said, we want to make sure that the Catholic faithful got as much of the Bible as they could. And so somewhere, somebody planted a seed in their mind, and they came up with what we know today as the 3-year cycle of Scriptures. So that cycle A is Matthew, that's the one we're in now. Cycle B is given to Mark's Gospel, which is next year. And cycle C is Luke's Gospel. John's Gospel gets scattered through, especially Mark, since Mark is short. John's Gospel gets attached to several places in the Gospel of Mark lectionary. But in any event, and there's also, if you were to go to church every day during the week, there's also scriptures that are read there that are sometimes different from Sunday. So supposedly, if you were to go to church every day for 3 years consistently, you would get about 85 to 90% of the Bible. That means that the lectionary, like that we have been using here, doesn't really give you an option to pick and choose. And one of the reasons why I believe very wholeheartedly in the lectionary is it means that I'm not going to pull text out of context, out of the Scripture, to kind of proof text some, brilliant idea or some theological concern that I might have or something, some other kind of thing. But I have to stick to the lectionary. Now, in reality, the Catholic lectionary had 3 readings. So you always had an Old Testament reading, then you had a reading from the writings of St. Paul, and then you had the gospel. Sometimes they sync with one another, sometimes they don't. And that's the challenge of the preacher, to try to figure out how to sync them or just to forget them and go on to something else. But in any event, that's how the Scripture. So, having said that, the lectionary cycle follows that narrative of Jesus. So Matthew began with the Advent stories in preparation for the birth of Jesus, and the lectionary flows through. Where we are now, that once Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, that the focus, at least, after all, we've been through this how many years? I'm 71, so at least, 60 plus years that I've been paying attention to this, and those of you who've been coming to church most of your life. So the stories are familiar to you. So we know how this story of Jesus is going to end, right? But the lectionary sets us up that roughly from about 2 weeks ago, we entered into Jerusalem, unbeknownst to us, because the entry into Jerusalem is reserved for Palm Sunday, down when we come up to Easter Holy Week. But in any event, we entered Jerusalem, and there's now been this engagement in the gospel itself, the contest, if you will, or the debates that are going on between Jesus and the authorities, whoever that might be. Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes, all are mentioned in these texts. So that's what's been happening in the gospel, and the lectionary is following that. Now, we won't get, of course, to the crucifixion and death, because that's, again, reserved for Holy Week, right? So what we'll get to is the Feast of Christ the King, or the reign of Christ, or the reign of Jesus, which comes at the end of November. So that's where we are. The focus of the gospel is on the ending of Jesus' life. Well, since we have Holy Week for that, the creators of the lectionary decided that, well, okay, we're going to celebrate Jesus' death and resurrection. We do that every year, since Easter is kind of the key Christian celebration, right? We all can agree on that. But there's another aspect, another level, or another layer to this whole coming to an end, and that has to do with the great ending. The great parousia, there's your $100 theological word for the day. Parousia, the great final revealing of God in Jesus when all will take place. And we'll hear this text more or less on the Reign of Christ Sunday at the end of what that looks like in Matthew's Gospel. So we've got the layer of Jesus coming to his death, crucifixion and death, but the lectionary moves us, we don't want to spend too much time because we've got a whole Holy Week to spend on that. So what we're going to do is kind of go off on a tangent into this great ending of time. So what we have to do when we hear these texts for the next several weeks is not just put ourselves into the narrative of Jesus, but the great narrative of the church, if you will, or the greater narrative of what Christianity is culminating in the great parousia of God, the great revelation of God, and the ending, yes, of time, if you will, the ending of everything, whenever that might be. And you see, this is one of the challenges, if we take that tangent, this is one of the challenges of that tangent, is that we want it to be maybe now, maybe when we die, that might be an ending. How long are we going to have to wait for this to happen? Somewhere out there. I always love it when the scientists talk about not just climate change, but in 5 million, whatever the number is, in 5 million years the sun will explode. Well, for God's sake, 5 million years, who the heck is going to be still around at that time, right? So, why should I be concerned about that? What has that got to do with anything? But in any event, that's kind of the trajectory of this view, this spiritual, theological view, is to take us to the great ending time out there. So embedded in the lectionary, so here's what you have to do, is if you put your lens glasses, like maybe you did yesterday, Steve and I were out in front of the house trying to figure out how we could see the eclipse without burning the retinas in our eyes and being permanently blind. And I finally figured out that there are several trees around our house, and if you watched the trees, you could see the crescent shape of the sun filtered through the trees, and I was so excited about that. At least I got to see that and took hundreds of pictures. No, I didn't take that many pictures. But I just thought that was great. Next year, we're already planning on going to St. Louis, where there's a total eclipse that will pass over St. Louis. So that's where we'll be whenever that happens next year. But in any event, I forgot what I was going to say, but in any event, when you take tangents, you see that's what happens. And that's a part of the challenge, not only of the lectionary, but a part of this challenge of trying to keep in contact with this life and ministry of Jesus, but also the life and ministry of the church, but also the life and ministry of disciples of Jesus, not congregational disciples, but where are we going to be? How is this all moving? Is it moving just to Jesus' death and resurrection? Is it moving to the great end, the cataclysm at the end in the parousia? Where is it that we're moving to? So reading an individual text has to have all of these layers. And now I remember what I was saying. That you put on the lens, you put on the glasses of looking at just the narrative. Here's what's going on. This conflict of authority, that the scribes and the Pharisees believe Jesus is claiming authority to himself when he's performed these miracles, when he's done his teaching and preaching. The scribes and the Pharisees believe that the only authority that exists is that which comes direct from the Torah itself. Oh, and by the way, from their institutional authority, being scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees of organized Judaism of the day. Jesus is standing outside. That's all. How can he possibly have any authority to do what he's doing? That's the embedded part, the narrative that's following. But something about this, notice how the parables that are being used here in Jerusalem, in the midst of this conflict, in the midst of this debate going on, remember, it's not just a debate anymore, right? Not just a debate anymore about Jesus and the Pharisees. It's perhaps a debate for us, so that we read it through those other lenses, right? That this is a journey that we're on, not just to the gospel ending, but this journey that we're on somewhere out there at the ending of our life when we die, or the great ending of time, that we're on this, so that we read it with a number of different layers and levels of understanding. So here's the entry point. The parable says a king throws a wedding banquet. Now you could just take it at face value, just right there. Leave it at face value. And then you could go on explaining it. But I want you to consider this, because the audience of Jesus, if the audience of Jesus are Jews of the first century, some more educated than others, but more likely that if they are faithful Jews, they probably have been regular attendees at their local synagogue. And there, the Torah itself, the reading from Genesis through the end of Numbers, that the Torah itself has a cycle of readings, that you begin at the beginning and you read straight through. In fact, we're coming up to the time when that ending of the readings for the given year happens in Jewish synagogues, even today. So that they would have heard all the stories that are pertinent to them, plus there would have been teachings, preachings, opportunities to listen to the scriptures not found just in the Torah or the first 5 books. You would also hear readings from the prophets, because that would be included in the regular, quote, lectionary of Judaism, even in the first century. That you would hear embedded in the parable of Jesus things that would kind of ring a bell in your ear. Oh, a wedding banquet. So, I'm pushing the metaphor, if you will. Oh, a wedding banquet. Well, that sounds familiar. Where have I heard this before? Well, see, we have to work at it, because we're not familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. That we have to work at this. So it may sound like I'm forcing the metaphor or forcing the image. It's because we're unfamiliar. For a Jew, even then, as much as it is now, that just the mere mention of wedding banquet sends off pictures and images in your mind about some kind of reality that the community would be invited to consider at that moment. And the reality is, and here I mentioned it in the Sojourner, that in Isaiah 25, the invitation, now here again, a little bit of context, Isaiah 25 comes from the perspective of the prophet Isaiah in Jerusalem, looking at the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by first the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. And so the prophet in Jerusalem is looking at that, and you know what happens? That when there is not only a physical crisis, but also all of the emotional crisis that goes along with that, so that you didn't have to be tuned into CNN or Fox News sitting in Jerusalem. All you had to do was listen to all of the rumors spreading around Jerusalem at the time that we had better be prepared for what might happen to us. If it happened to them in the north, it could happen to us. And so the prophet Isaiah begins to speak to that fear, anxiety, that great concern that we are at the edge of coming to an end ourselves. And what happens is that when that experience, when that moment in time happens, and we're experiencing the fear and the trepidation, and we're experiencing all of the kind of collapse that is going on around that moment in time. Hi, welcome. Glad to have you with us today. When we're in that moment of time, that the perspective of the literature, if you will, or the perspective of the prophet's preaching has to do with not that moment in time alone, but what's going to come in the future. In other words, what's going to address that fear and anxiety and perhaps deep despair, what can possibly address that in us that will move us past being paralyzed by it and will move us to continue to live, not just exist, but will enable us to continue to live and perhaps even prosper, if we will. And so that type of literature comes to be called, here's another big word for you today, that type of literature comes to be called apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature, in all of what it gets interpreted and understood as, apocalyptic literature has to do with that moment in time of crisis, of fear, of trepidation, of anxiety, of the concern that everything is coming unglued. Sounds like today, doesn't it? Everything is coming unglued, and we just want to know how we fit into all of that and what the future is going to be. And so that text in Isaiah for that time, and that's all the way back about 720 years before the Common Era, that text says this. Isaiah says to the people of Jerusalem and maybe even to the refugees coming down from the north, on that day, on the mountain of God, there will be a great feast, and the great feast will set out great foods, the most delicious foods you could ever imagine, the choicest wines from the choicest vines. On that day, all the peoples of the earth will come to gather on God's holy mountain. And you can kind of guess, and there we will find ourselves being saved, that God will save us. There's also, a little bit more, there's also embedded in the whole of the tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures. How do you describe the relationship between the people of Israel and God? Well, there's many ways you can describe this relationship. And one of the ways that it gets described in various places within the Hebrew Scriptures is one of Israel, the people, the community of Israel, being the bride, and God being the bridegroom. And so that the relationship between God and the people is described as a marriage relationship. And at the heart of that marriage relationship is a covenantal bond. In fact, today, if you read through it, I've done several Jewish Christian weddings, that actually a couple is married when they sign what's called the ketubah. And the ketubah is this declaration of what the responsibilities and obligations of their lives together are going to be. Usually supported by the father and the mother of the groom. Perhaps today it's both sets of parents. But in any event, once they sign that document, they're married. And then only it comes, if they want, to have a public celebration, of that document having been signed. And that's when they exchange, perhaps in a more contemporary way, rings with each other. And, if you've seen any of those kinds of things, that's what happens. So that relationship described as God as the groom and Israel as the bride. Well, now you see, it adds a dimension to this text in the gospel today, that if the king is throwing a wedding banquet for his son, behind that we have to hear all of what I've just shared with you, so that you bring all of that to an understanding of the text, that now we're talking about on one level, the relationship that exists between God and the people of Israel, but also on another level, this future moment in time when this relationship of the bride and the bridegroom will clearly define the relationship that all the peoples of the earth have with reference to God. And if all the peoples of the earth are now a part of this relationship, in other words, when the commandments are given and when everything unfolds from the moment of the Exodus to whenever, that when that all unfolds, that all the peoples, that no one's going to be left out of this relationship. That it's no longer just between God and Israel, it's now between God and humanity. Now you see, this works great because in the larger vision of God with reference to the whole of the universe, that God doesn't just intend to be in relationship with one person or even one group, one religion. Why? Why would I even say that? Because everyone has been created by God. If everyone has been created by God, then why would anyone be left out of that great wedding banquet? That everybody's going to be included in it. I love it. In my class right now that I'm teaching, one of my students, oh my God, he is so smart and above everybody else in the class, that he sent me a private note last night. I read it. And he said, I just need you to know I'm an agnostic. And we've been engaging in this conversation with each other. And here we are in, talking about the Christian worldview and trying to have an understanding of how Christian bioethics and Christian values and morals shape and form the work of a nurse. And he says he's an agnostic. And I said, that's great. You're a part of this whole thing, and I just love hearing your point of view because your point of view is just as important as anybody else's point of view. Why? Because when we are inclusive rather than exclusive, we not only get to understand ourselves more, we also get to understand others better. And what happens when we end up there? The community is stronger, that we're in relationship with people who are different from us, who think differently from us, that we're in a position to have a greater respect for one another, but also a greater reverence for the way that we are engaged in community with each other. Now, back to the parable. You notice it's interesting, isn't it? Now, and by the way, there's one line where the king sends out the armies and destroys the villages that the scholars say that verse should really be taken out, because that is not of Matthew, nor would it have been in the vision of Jesus. So just so you know that. Take that verse out, and it still makes sense. But what's happening is that the invite goes to a select few people, and now here's Matthew's take on this. Goes to a select few people, and in going to a select few people, the expectation is that if the invite goes out to them, that they will accept the invite. After all, it's a wedding banquet. And why would you ever turn down free food and drink? Now that's in the ancient world. Today you have to, right? You've been married recently, right? I know. Oh my God, it's up to like $250 a plate for a couple to host a reception. So in case you got kids coming up, you better start putting money away in your savings account. Because by the time that they get old enough to be married, it's going to be $1,000 a plate. And that's not just coming in and serving McDonald's. They're going to elope. You want to encourage that, right? Right. In any event, the invite, why would you want to refuse the invite? And you see, the invitation goes out carrying the expectation of the king, or we could say, the expectation of God is that if we're going to have this wonderful wedding banquet celebrating our relationship with each other, that all the peoples are invited. But notice what happens. Some say, I got better things to do. I've got farm, I got business, I got kids, I got this, I got that, I got better things to do. Now, hint, hint, what the hell better is there than coming to a banquet where there's free food? What would you possibly be thinking about that you could have something better than the great wedding banquet of God? There's nothing better than that. Why would you choose anything else? And I think that's a part of the frustration that frequently in the scripture, God just says, what am I going to do about this people? I keep loving them. I keep reaching out to them. I keep saving them. I keep healing them. I keep leading them. I keep trying to tell them they need to ask directions when they're wandering in the desert for 40 years and they won't listen to me. And God must just go, what else can I possibly do to convince them that there's nothing better than to choose this banquet? You aren't going to get better food. You're not going to have better drink outside this banquet. But some choose other. They're free to make that choice, right? They're free to make that choice. Maybe that's a part of the challenge. They keep thinking that that other is better. And maybe it is. But you see, when the great trajectory of the end comes, right? You know the phrase, you can't take it with you. You can't take it with you. But you always have this, the great banquet. Now, the troubling part of this whole story is, you get the inclusion, right? That the king sends out the servants to go out into the highways and byways and gather whoever. That's the inclusion. That's the vision of inclusion. The poor, the blind, the lame, the sinner, the tax collector, the agnostics, the atheists, the Buddhists, the Hindus. And there's no expectation that they have to convert to anything. They just come as they are. They just come hungry. That's all that's expected. Just be hungry when you come to the banquet. And even if you've stopped at McDonald's or Starbucks on the way, still, there's plenty of food for you to take home and to... there's still plenty here. Come and eat and drink. That's what the book of wisdom says. Come and eat and drink. The lavish banquet is ready. But then, somebody shows up without the right clothes on. And this is so troubling in the text. I struggle with it because it's like, you just said everybody's welcome. And how could you possibly expect somebody off the street to be wearing the right robe when they come to the banquet? Well, I've kind of given you a hint that I suppose there's always freedom of choice to think that the other is better than what you've been offered. You know, part of this has to do, I think, with realizing that this is something so special that at least you want to be able to enter into what it is in such a way that perhaps you show respect for yourself as much as you show respect for others. That might be a part of it. And I have a whole lot more I could say about that. But you see, the last line is the part of the catcher. How does it go again? Many are called. Many are invited, but few are chosen. From God's perspective, everyone's invited. From our perspective, we often make the choice not to accept the invitation. The weight of this is on that individual for choosing to dress as he always did, which maybe he didn't have any other choice, or elevating it. You know, when you hear such good news and you don't accept it or embrace it, then I don't know what else there is. This is the good news. This is the meal that puts you on a trajectory, not to the parousia or to the crucifixion and death of Jesus, but this is accepting the invitation to enter into a lavish banquet where everyone is welcome. To accept that invitation clearly suggests that you put yourself in a different way of thinking about everything else in the world. I don't know if that makes sense. It puts us into thinking. You see, we're still people who think that there's a scarcity out there. And these days, I know I go to the grocery store and I have a particular item in mind, and I get to that shelf in the grocery store and it's not there. So thank you, pandemic, over the past 5 or 6 years. Somehow the production mechanisms of our world have led us into having scarcity again, thinking back to those who went through the Great Depression. You see, our minds want to think that there isn't enough. Our minds also want to think that nobody's going to tell me how to dress, what I can do, how to go wherever I want to go. I had a student this past week who said, the Christian vision says we can do whatever we want. And I usually don't correct the student, but I had to come back to the student and I had to say, that's not the Christian vision. We can't do whatever we want. And the reason is because if we have entered into this covenantal relationship with God, that we supposedly, willingly or unwillingly or unconsciously, have accepted the vision that God has in store for us. And so when we accept that vision that God has in store for us, then the choices and decisions always have to be made with reference to that. That's what it means. That's the bottom line. So that if this is a lavish banquet meant for all, then there isn't anything else. And yet we keep thinking there is something else. And when we do that, you see, the trajectory isn't to the parousia or to Jesus' death and resurrection. As Deuteronomy says, today I set before you life and death. Choose life, that you may have an abundance. Choose death, and its end, the darkness, the chaos again. Choose death, and its emptiness, nothingness. You have a choice. The lavish banquet, where there's an abundance, or nothing. You see, this becomes important because when it comes down to the end of the narrative and we stand at the cross of Jesus, knowing that the end is death, will we then say, not me, I'm not going to accept this at all, and go on our way because we didn't want to accept the robe of the wedding banquet. That's the challenge of many of these parables, is there's difficult moments that we have to struggle with and grapple with. And there's not going to be a clear answer to any of the questions that we have. But it's in the process of struggling with the questions and trying to find some resolution for ourselves that it might just open a little bit of our closed minds and hard-heartedness to embrace a vision where all the peoples gather, eating a banquet and being in relationship with one another and enjoying one another's company. That's the vision of the reign of God.